6,000 years ago, there were hippos swimming in the middle of the Sahara Desert. Not on the edge of it, not near some oasis. In the middle, where you now see nothing but sand for 1,000 miles in every direction, there was once a lake almost the size of the Caspian Sea, crocodiles in the shallows, giraffes wandering between forests, and human beings painting all of it onto rock walls that are still there today. Then, within about 100 years, it all disappeared. The lakes dried up. The forests died. The desert we know today was born almost overnight in geological terms. I'm telling you that story first because it changes how you should think about everything else in this video. Because right now, there is a massive, multi-billion-dollar international effort trying to stop the Sahara from doing what it's done before. It's usually described as a UN project. It isn't, really. And what's actually happening on the ground is stranger, messier, and more revealing than almost anyone reporting on it wants to admit. Before we get into it, if you want more videos that dig past the press release and into what's actually happening on the ground, hit subscribe now, because this channel is about to get a lot more interesting. Let's start with the myth. You have probably heard of the Great Green Wall. The idea sounds almost too simple to be real. Plant a line of trees 15 kilometers wide, stretching 8,000 kilometers across the entire width of Africa, from Senegal on the Atlantic coast to Djibouti on the Red Sea. A living wall to physically block the Sahara from swallowing the Sahel, the fragile strip of semi-arid land just south of it. Here's what most coverage gets wrong. This was not dreamed up by the United Nations. It was dreamed up decades earlier by a revolutionary president of Burkina Faso named Thomas Sankara. In the 1980s, Sankara looked at the Sahara advancing on his country and launched an aggressive tree planting campaign, banning uncontrolled logging and free-roaming cattle, and personally riding his bicycle from village to village to talk to farmers about trees. His government planted over 10 million trees in less than a year and a half. In a speech to Western leaders in Paris, he told them bluntly that if they could spend fortunes searching for life on other planets, they could spend 1% of that money helping save the trees and the people on this one. In 1987, Sankara was assassinated in a coup. His environmental program lost its momentum along with him. It would take almost 20 years and a very different set of institutions to revive his idea. That revival came in 2007 when the African Union formally adopted the Great Green Wall as a continent-wide initiative. The United Nations didn't create it, but the UN's agencies, especially the UN Convention to Combat Desertification, became deeply involved in funding it, coordinating it, and reporting on it. And that convention itself has a backstory most people never hear. It exists because of a famine. Between 1968 and 1974, the Sahel was hit by a catastrophic drought that killed off livestock and triggered a famine so severe it forced the first large-scale international aid mobilization in the region's history. A second, even worse drought hit in the mid-1980s. Out of that horror, the United Nations eventually created its Convention to Combat Desertification in 1994. One of only 3 major environmental treaties to come out of the 1992 Earth Summit in Rio. So, by the time the Great Green Wall launched in 2007, there was already a UN machine in place, ready to fund it, measure it, and put it on the world stage. Leaders promised it would restore an area of degraded land 4 times the size of the entire state of Wyoming. They promised 10 million new jobs. They promised to pull 250 million tons of carbon out of the atmosphere. And they promised to do it all by 2030. Now here's where the story gets uncomfortable, because depending on which official source you check, this project is either a near total failure or a slow but steady success. And nobody can agree on which. The Great Green Wall's own website has claimed the project was 15% complete since 2019. That number has not moved in 6 years. Meanwhile, a widely cited 2020 investigation found that only 4% of the target area had actually been planted, And even that 4% leaned heavily on tree planting numbers out of Ethiopia that independent researchers have since questioned. More recent estimates from 2024 put completion around 30%. 3 different numbers, 3 different years, all describing the exact same project. Why the confusion? Because the project doesn't actually measure its own progress using satellite imagery of live vegetation. It largely measures success by counting trees planted or land that's simply been set aside for future regeneration, whether or not anything ever actually grows there. It's the equivalent of a company reporting how many seeds it bought instead of how many plants survived. And when scientists have gone in and actually checked with satellites, the results are brutal. A study published in 2025 examined the Great Green Wall's plots in Senegal, one of the most committed and best-funded countries in the entire initiative. Researchers compared 36 planted areas against what would have grown there naturally, with no human intervention at all. Only one of those 36 areas was greener than it would have been anyway. The other 35 showed no meaningful benefit from years of funded tree planting. Seedlings were dying in dry years or being trampled and eaten by cattle in areas that were never properly fenced. Now, if you want to understand why that keeps happening, you have to follow the money, and this is where the story turns from disappointing into genuinely infuriating. In 2021, at a glamorous summit in Paris hosted by French President Emmanuel Macron, world leaders pledged $14.3 billion in new funding for the Great Green Wall. Add in earlier pledges, and by some counts, total commitments have topped $20 billion. Here's the number that matters more. By early 2023, only about $2.5 billion of that had actually been dispersed, not spent on trees, just transferred out of donor accounts at all. It gets worse the closer you look at individual countries. A 2020 audit found that Great Green Wall nations, combined, had received a grand total of just $149 million between 2011 and 2019, despite years of billion-dollar headlines. In Djibouti, the government official running the entire National Great Green Wall office told journalists his team had received only $30 million over an entire decade of operation, less than 10% of what they'd originally been promised. Let me give you one specific human story, because statistics like these are easy to skip past, and this one shouldn't be skipped. In the village of Kordamali in Djibouti, international funding paid for a farmer named Abdi Gwele to get a borehole, a solar-powered water pump, and a small dam, all built to irrigate a patch of desert. It worked. For a while, his community grew tomatoes and vegetables and even sold the surplus. Then, the dam started leaking. The pump broke. There was no more money to fix either one. Today, that farm is back to being empty desert, with nothing left but the memory of what briefly grew there. Multiply that story by hundreds of similar villages across 11 countries, and you start to understand why the numbers on paper and the reality on the ground look nothing alike. It's not just mismanagement either. Investigative reporting published in the summer of 2026 found that the European Union alone gave over €1.5 billion to the Great Green Wall between 2021 and 2023, including €123 million specifically earmarked for Chad. Staff inside Chad's own National Great Green Wall Agency said most of that money never even reached them. It went straight to international NGOs and consultants running their own separate projects, while Chad's own agency reportedly couldn't afford to visit its own project sites to check on them. There's an even sharper example. A wildlife reserve in Senegal called Koili Alpha was set up in 2017 with at least 25 million Canadian dollars from the European Union, the FAO, and Canada. It was supposed to become a community-run ecotourism site, complete with a guard post to protect it. 5 years later, journalists visiting the site found 3 guards sitting under an acacia tree because the guard post they were supposed to be working from had simply never been built. This is why a growing number of scientists and African researchers have started calling the whole project a form of green neocolonialism. In 2023, a group of researchers publicly accused Macron of essentially confiscating an African-led initiative and turning it into a Western-branded showpiece. One researcher who conducted detailed fieldwork in Senegal argued that even when money does arrive, the pressure to satisfy foreign donors pushes it toward the kind of projects Western audiences expect to see: fenced reserves, photogenic tree nurseries, rather than the messier, less telegenic things that actually work on the ground. Critics also point out that the very word desertification has roots in French colonial vocabulary, and that pushing nomadic herders to settle around fixed watering points echoes colonial-era population control policies from a century ago. Take a breath here, because I want you to sit with something. If you've made it this far, you already know more about this project than most people who've heard the phrase Great Green Wall on the news. If this kind of investigation is something you want more of, now is the time to subscribe. Because the next part of this story is honestly the most surprising thing I've found. While the official, internationally funded, UN-monitored Great Green Wall was struggling to keep one tree alive out of 36, something almost nobody talks about was quietly succeeding just a few hundred miles away, without billions of dollars, without a single international summit, and almost entirely by accident. In 1983, an Australian agronomist named Tony Rinaudo was working in Niger, trying and failing to get farmers to plant trees in soil so hard and dry it felt like concrete. He was ready to give up entirely. Then he noticed something. What looked like worthless scrub bushes scattered across the farmland weren't actually bushes at all. They were the living stumps of full-grown trees that had been cut down years earlier, still alive underground, still capable of regrowing if farmers simply protected and pruned them instead of clearing them away. That single observation became a technique called Farmer Managed Natural Regeneration. Around the same time, a Burkina farmer named Yakuba Sawadogo independently revived an ancient method called zai pits, digging small holes packed with manure that trap rainwater and let dormant tree seeds sprout on their own. Locals eventually started calling him the man who stopped the desert. Neither of these techniques needed a UN summit. Neither needed a foreign consultant flown in on a per diem. They needed farmers, given the freedom to try something, and left alone to keep doing it if it worked. And it worked at a scale that dwarfs almost everything the official Great Green Wall has managed to report. By 2004, this farmer-led regeneration was already being practiced on more than 5 million hectares, roughly half of all farmland in Niger, adding trees at an average rate of 250,000 hectares a year for 2 decades straight. Across the wider region, from Senegal to Malawi, satellite surveys have found roughly 24 million hectares now under some form of this farmer-driven regrowth. All of it accomplished at a cost of roughly $14 a hectare in labor, compared to the $40 or $50 a hectare that standard, internationally funded tree planting typically costs. Read that again. A leaderless, grassroots, farmer-driven movement with almost no international funding appears to have restored more land than the flagship $20 billion internationally coordinated initiative that gets all the headlines. Now let's talk about the desert itself, because there's a scientific twist here that almost never makes it into the news coverage. Vegetation south of the Sahara in the Sahel has genuinely increased somewhat since the 1980s, thanks partly to a return of more rainfall. But that is not the same thing as the Sahara shrinking. A study out of the University of Maryland found that the Sahara Desert itself has actually expanded by about 10% since 1920, with its southern edge pushing roughly 100 kilometers further south between 1950 and 2015 alone. Researchers estimate that roughly a third of that expansion is linked to human-driven climate change, with natural, decades-long climate cycles responsible for the rest. And this is where that opening story about the hippos becomes more than just a dramatic hook. The Sahara has flipped between lush and lifeless before, driven by nothing more than a slow wobble in the tilt of Earth's orbit that changes how much monsoon rain reaches North Africa. It happened roughly 6,000 to 11,000 years ago, and it happened within the span of just 1 or 2 human lifetimes. That doesn't mean human-driven climate change isn't accelerating what's happening now. It clearly is. But it does mean the story is more complicated than a simple villain narrative, where trees are the heroes and the desert is the enemy. This land has always been capable of transforming itself, long before anyone was around to fund a summit about it. There's one more comparison almost nobody makes, and it's a big one. China has its own version of a Great Green Wall. It's called the 3 North Shelter Belt Program, and it's been running since 1978, decades longer than Africa's version, and largely outside the international spotlight. A 2026 scientific comparison between the two projects concluded that green walls generally fail for one simple reason: a lack of continuous, stable funding and long-term maintenance. Something China's government-funded single-country approach has been able to provide in a way that a patchwork of foreign pledges across 11 separate African nations simply cannot. And funding isn't even the only obstacle on the ground. Parts of the corridor the Great Green Wall is supposed to run through are also active operating zones for armed groups, including Boko Haram and Ansar Dine. A wave of military coups in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger in recent years has made international donors increasingly nervous about investing in exactly the countries that need it most, quietly shifting funding toward more politically stable nations like Senegal and Ethiopia instead, regardless of where the actual need is greatest. So where does that leave things right now? A new $222 million program called Suragua, launched in December of 2025 to try to accelerate restoration across 8 Sahelian countries. Officials at a major Great Green Wall gathering in Djibouti in early 2026 openly admitted that in some areas, less than 10% of promised international funding is actually reaching the people implementing projects on the ground. And in Nigeria alone, the desert is still swallowing an estimated 35,000 hectares of land every single year. So is the UN holding back the Sahara Desert? The honest answer is more complicated than the headline. The institutions involved have poured billions of dollars in pledges into a genuinely important cause, and in doing so, they've raised global awareness of a crisis that deserved much more attention than it ever got. But on the ground, the actual physical wall of trees that captured the world's imagination in 2007 barely exists. What has worked, where it's worked at all, looks almost nothing like the plan. It looks like farmers in Niger noticing a stump, a man in Burkina Faso digging small holes in dry ground, millions of ordinary decisions made without a single press conference. Meanwhile, the desert itself keeps doing what it's done for tens of thousands of years, indifferent to summits, pledges, and press releases, expanding and retreating on a timeline that has never once cared what humans wanted from it. If this video changed how you think about a story you thought you already understood, that's exactly what this channel is for. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and tell me in the comments which part of this surprised you the most, because there is a lot more of this hiding behind headlines you've probably already scrolled past.